After the week that rocked America and the world, we look at what really happened in Washington DC and, more importantly, what happens next. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. It's not often you get a week that will go down in history as an iconic event, one that will come to define a moment, and that's definitely what happened this week. No, it wasn't an attempted coup, and it wasn't an insurrection. It had no organisation, no goal. There was no pathway for a coup to be successful. But it was a massive miscalculation by a president whose inability to follow any sort of political strategy took him from a position where he could have made a powerful fight back for 2024 to one where he is effectively done, finished. That's reportedly the opinion, in any case, of the president's closest aides in the White House, who were exasperated and depressed, believing that what they saw as 4 years of successes had been nullified, and the story of his presidency will forever after be defined by him sending a mob to the Capitol in an assault on democracy. Mick Mulvaney, the chief of staff, who was a number who stood down, he suggested that the president had become increasingly affected in the months since the election. He said this: "Clearly he is not the same as he was 8 months ago, and certainly the people advising him are not the same as they were 8 months ago, and that leads to a dangerous sort of combination as you saw yesterday." And the invasion wasn't an attempted coup, but it was a violent assault on the democratic centre of the country. Yes, most of the people who invaded were pretty benign. They were clearly amazed to have gotten in, had no real idea what they wanted to do, wandered around taking selfies and the like, keeping within the rope barriers and everything. But pipe bombs were planted in two-party offices. A police officer has died of his injuries from the altercations, plus, of course, the death of one protester who was shot dead, and 3 others with what would somewhat bizarrely described as medical emergencies. I gather one fell from a wall that they were climbing. You'd think you would call that an accident or misadventure. One accidentally tasered himself and had a heart attack. Whatever, those were real deaths, and they are not supposed to happen in the peaceful transfer of power in the United States. Now, you can play the game of contrasting the way that riots in the summer were described as mostly peaceful, if you like, but the truth is that they were wrong, and so was this. The answer to the hypocrisy of the people who ignored violence in the past isn't to go and do the exact same thing in the present. I can imagine people on the right are finding it galling to see people constantly stating, as they have been, as Joe Biden indeed did, that if this had been a group of black people, you know they would have been treated differently. It's just the latest indicator of what I've said before, that America's problem is not that it has polarised politics, but that it now has 2 large groups of people who no longer even agree on reality. People who see the same events and come up with completely different versions of what just happened. Trump supporters have been seeing for months, and they've been wrong about many things, but they're not wrong about this one. That by and large, in numerous US cities, BLM riots were destroying people's businesses and civic buildings, and those rioters were being allowed to do so with extraordinarily little resistance, certainly in the earlier days. That BLM protests were smiled upon while all others were told that because of COVID-19, if you gathered, then you were a terrible person, as though the coronavirus cares about your politics. And those Trump supporters were also pointing out that whenever there was a Trump demonstration, it was always peaceful, except when an Antifa group attacked someone from the Trump side. It might even have been that reputation that was one of the factors in the DC police believing that they didn't need a heavy-handed presence and turning down federal assistance. However, the other side believe, and from every indicator, I think it's a sincere belief, that BLM protests have routinely been met with aggressive force. No doubt they sometimes have, but it's the perceptions of norms that are wildly at variance between the two sides. It's like any dysfunctional relationship you've ever been in. As soon as it gets to the point where you're keeping score, you only ever see and remember the things that you want to see. And now, and you might as well get used to this story because from now on it will always be the story, Trump supporters are seen as violent. Whatever hope the right ever had of arguing that its side doesn't riot and it's the side of law and order, that has been squashed by what happened this week. Full stop. Doesn't matter whether it's fair or not. Actions have consequences. Yes, Trump, in his garbled way, almost certainly didn't intend this to happen like this. He told them to be peaceful, but he also said a lot more ambiguous things as well. We should recognise it's probably because he struggles to express his ideas particularly clearly. We've seen that for 4 years, but his audience included a bunch of people who'd spent years thinking he was sending them carefully crafted, coded messages, QAnon. And he did encourage them to go to the Capitol with the intent of putting pressure on the senators to do the right thing, telling them that Mike Pence somehow had the power to cancel Biden's electoral college votes, which he didn't. Totally obviously, he didn't. And therefore throwing him under the bus when he didn't do what he hadn't and shouldn't have had the power to do. And that for some is why it was an attempted coup, because it was an attempt, however misguided, to reverse a legitimate result. There is a system. An election was held. If it was not run properly, the system is that you challenge that in the courts. That system was used and in this case did not succeed. Therefore, de facto, the result is legitimate. The week started, of course, with a phone conference call between Trump and the election officials of Georgia. Various people heard that call and focused on what they thought was him asking them to manipulate the results to show that he'd won. Well, I listened to the whole of that call, not just for highlights. The obvious thing, if you step back and just listen to it without being desperate to come to a preconceived conclusion, was this. Trump believes everything he says. There is no evidence that has stood up that there's been fraud in the election in anything like the quantity that would have been needed to flip the result. But regardless of that, it's not an act. It's not a political calculation. He is utterly, utterly convinced he won and it was stolen. His inability in his public pronouncements not to repeat the claims, even when his interests would have been massively served better by taking a different course, his increasing bunker mentality, surrounding himself only with advisors who would reinforce this belief. All of it has been because he is simply unable to consider any other reality. And he clearly, sincerely believed that Pence had the power to intercede. If that was a thing, of course, Joe Biden could have prevented him from becoming president back in 2016. And he wanted the crowd to go to the Capitol to put pressure on Pence. That was as much of a plan as he had. According to reports, when his supporters stormed into the Capitol, he was pleased. One reason why it took so long before he finally responded to aides pleading with him to call them off. What Trump probably didn't know was the fact that his supporters had come with an equally alternative reality, but one where the stakes were massively higher. Because this was the QAnon mentality. The forums showed the people who came were utterly convinced that Trump had summoned them for a great purpose, that he had a plan, he would triumphantly overturn the result and the corrupt centre of the deep state at the same time. That he had signalled to them they needed to be there, armed and ready. When he simply made the same speech to them that he always makes, they were stunned, disappointed and confused. He told them to go to the Capitol, said he would be there with them, but then he wasn't. And they had no idea what they should do next. But they thought something major was supposed to happen. So it's only natural that when they found the Capitol weakly defended, they should follow the opportunity. A leader and his people bound together by an astonishing degree of mutual misunderstanding. Now we're seeing a number of things playing out. Democrats are trying to work out if they can remove Trump from his final couple of weeks, preferably by impeachment that would prevent him from running again in 2024, possibly through the use of the 25th Amendment. They're also now seeking to tar all Republicans with the same brush, suggesting that anyone who ever supported Trump at any point in the last 4 years somehow helped to make this happen. As far as people on the left are concerned, they were always convinced that Trump was a wannabe Hitler, and this has now confirmed it. And just in case you forgot, because it already feels like a rather long time ago, this week also saw the Democrats take control of the Senate. potentially opening up new possibilities for the incoming Biden administration. Now, in a minute, we'll talk about what's going to happen next once the immediate fallout has happened. Both parties are facing possible splits. Then there's the question of how radical the new administration is going to be able to be. But first, this week, it feels appropriate to spend a bit more time reflecting on the bigger picture questions that led to this moment. How did America become this partisan? It's a history that goes back quite some way. And the awful truth is this: it wasn't by accident. Next week, I'll be looking at how it came about, what are the lessons we might take from it, and what will be the difference between a healthy division in a democratic USA and a broken country that can only fracture apart. Join me for that video on Monday next week, going live at 7 p.m. UK time. Alright, so let's talk about what all of this means for the future. Once the dust settles, there will be an inauguration on January the 20th. Joe Biden will become the next president of the United States. We know this. Various Republican commentators, the likes of Ben Shapiro, Dan Bongino, have been painting this scenario with Biden having control of both houses as the nightmare scenario, arguing that radical long-term changes to the country's institutions would result. The Democrats will create 2 new states, changing the balance in their favour, end the filibuster, meaning they can push more things through the House, pack the Supreme Court. A lot of that was electioneering. You talk up the stakes. The post-election reality is somewhat less threatening by all accounts, largely because even if the Democrats control the Senate on Kamala Harris's casting vote, the presence of certain moderate Democrats means that they can't simply push through radical policies whatever they want. Joe Manchin specifically has gone on record saying that he wouldn't support an end to the filibuster nor any attempt to pack the Supreme Court. So those sorts of measures that could change the balance of power for a longer period of time, those seem unlikely to pass. The same for really big radical measures such as the AOC version of the Green New Deal. The same for massive tax increases, although there'll certainly be some increases targeting businesses and higher earners. Biden will be able to get climate policy passed and will probably do so with the support of moderate Republicans, but it won't be able to be a Trojan horse for every socialist policy that the Democrats' radical base would have liked to have seen implemented, which was what the original AOC Green New Deal tried to achieve. If you care about action on climate change, that might well be the best outcome. Nothing loses support for a whole area more than badly thought through policy that has unintended consequences. That opens up fault lines for the Democrats, as it always would have. You will have the radical base itching to see its favoured initiatives brought to the fore, and a party whose grasp on power is so slender that the moderates will be keen to keep their feet firmly on the ground. The maths on the midterm elections, when you look at which party's defending which seats, is pretty favourable for the Democrats. Maybe to make further inroads, so long as they don't do a bunch of stupid stuff in their first 2 years. We've seen numerous times parties get their first 2 years in control of the House only to have the midterms swing against them. The radicals will argue, this is our opportunity. If we don't take it, the door will close on us again. The moderates will argue, if we handle this well, after the chaos of Trump, we may consolidate our hold next time. We can't afford to blow it. Which side wins out will probably be fought on an issue-by-issue basis, so long as Joe Biden remains healthy and in control. The Biden mental decline issues don't go away now that he's won, although now the machinery of the White House can support him, as it did Reagan towards the end of his presidency. He does seem to be more in control than he was during the campaign, and it may well be that the purpose and the activity of the job in itself will help to slow any decline. The big question is what's going to happen next for Republicans. Up until this week, what seemed possible was that Trump would become de facto the leader of the opposition, in control of his base, therefore with an unshakable grip on the party. It would be acknowledged that the candidacy was his for the asking in 2024, and he would have been able to feed off the inevitable mistakes of the Biden administration to give himself the best shot of that. That possibility is now dead. 100% extinct. Trump turned on the GOP establishment big time this week, throwing Pence under the bus, attacking every other Republican that acknowledged the Biden election win. The establishment Republicans were furious already that, in their view, Trump's talk of election fraud was what persuaded supporters from his base, rural voters specifically, not to turn out for the Georgia runoff elections. After all, if the election is rigged, why bother to vote? And the margins on the Georgia election were so tight, even a small percentage who came to that conclusion turned out to be the difference. Trump's power over his party came from his hold over a base that had rejuvenated the GOP. Likewise, the failure to engage that base starts to diminish any hold that you have. But then on Wednesday, that went completely the other way. Trump specifically told his base how terrible the mainstream GOP was. And many genuinely believe that Mike Pence, who supported Trump incredibly loyally throughout his turbulent presidency, is a literal traitor, and much the same for all the others. At the Biden confirmation vote, you had 8 Republican senators voting to strike the results down, largely individuals such as Ted Cruz, who nursed the ambition of inheriting Trump's base post-Trump and using them to ride to the White House themselves. And then you had a number of others who had been loyal Trump supporters over 4 years, saying this has gone too far. People like Senator Tom Cotton saying this attack on the institutions of the state, every system that makes the country work, all in the name of one man's ego, we've had enough. So the huge question becomes, what will be the nature of the Republican Party by 2024? Will it remain the party of Trump post-Trump, where it adopts the themes and the mission of Trump, but aiming to do so without the flaws of the man himself, maybe with someone like Ted Cruz taking the mantle? Or will it be the moderate Republican Party, the sort that Representative Tom Reed of New York, who's emerged as a leader of moderates in the House, would seek to create? He argued this week that Republicans should stop worrying about the base, pursue instead compromised legislation with Biden on issues such as climate change. I pointed in the past to a group of moderate Republicans who wanted to move the party into a more realistic framing for climate issues. They've been out in the cold during the Trump years. But you can expect, if there's to be a backlash against those years in this coming period, they will see it as their opportunity to make up some important ground. And if you did end up with that sort of GOP, would it end up being challenged by a third-party challenger, perhaps a third party led by Trump himself or by one of his family members? If it comes down to a fight for the heart and soul of the GOP and the Trump base were to lose, do we think they'd give up and go home? Or would they try to create their own unique pathway? Either way, change is going to be the political new normal for the next year or two at least. Whether you see that as a risk or an opportunity is very much down to you. Now, in a minute, we'll respond to a couple of comments and do the final thought for the week. But first, in the spirit of looking at how we became divided, I'll be looking at one case study of how misinformation and persuasion techniques are being used to persuade people of things that simply aren't true. The more you're familiar with the techniques that get used against you, the more likely you can spot them in action and look more critically at the sources of information being presented to you. Video doing that will be coming up on Wednesday next week, being released at 7 p.m. UK time. See you there for that one. A couple of comments from this week's video, starting with Monday's about the replicability crisis in science. You were doing well until you started quoting Dawkins. He's an excellent example of an activist, religious atheism, pretending to be an objective scientist. I've highlighted this one because it's representative of a number that I get on here, except that the person involved will differ. It could be particular climate scientists like Michael Mann or Peter Ridd. Yes, it goes both ways. It can be all sorts of people. Anyone I quote, it turns out, someone loathes them. And they let me know in the comments that simply quoting that person has shot my credibility in their eyes. Well, here's my generic answer to all such comments. I don't care. I'm sorry you have a personal gremlin who triggers you to stop paying attention to an argument or a discussion because the mere mention of their name focuses you on the seething cauldron of rage within you. On this channel, I promote free speech discussion of issues and ideas based on reason, argument, and facts. If I quote someone saying something you disagree with, and I don't refute their arguments myself in the video, then sure, by all means, tell me why you disagree with their argument. If you want to add some background colour about how much you dislike the person, why? Well, okay, if you have to, it's fine. But that should be secondary to the argument, the discussion. If I quote someone saying something you agree with, but you can't bear to consider the words coming from that person, well, really, too bad. And I had to come back on this to say, so you're saying you'd quote Hitler if he said something that would make your point? It's always the Hitler argument. The fact that you don't like Richard Dawkins or Michael Mann or Bill Gates or whoever, Greta Thunberg, bloody Kim Kardashian for all I care, that doesn't make the person the embodiment of the evil that Hitler represents. However much you don't like them. If someone's widely held to be compromised in a certain way, then it doesn't serve my argument to quote them in support. So bye-bye Adolf. But your personal dislike should not be confused with that situation. Okay, then a question from the solar dimming video. And having mentioned Bill Gates already once, let's get him again. My first question is, whom are the entities supporting Scopex, and does Bill Gates and the supporters have a stake in calcium carbonate? You remember that video talks about the plan to inject calcium carbonate in large quantities into the stratosphere. Well, calcium carbonate is a relatively easy to source and cheap to buy industrial chemical. So that wouldn't be much of an investment proposition. But again, I've included this question because this sort of question is very common. And look, Bill Gates made his squillions in computer software. He's now in the business of giving some of it away. You obviously think that's an impossibly weird thing to contemplate, but it's actually an extremely common pattern that you can see through history since the Industrial Revolution. People make their money and then they either want to give something back to the society that got them there, or they even realise that all the competitive focus they had on getting to the top of the pile didn't actually make them happy once they got there. So they then decide they want to do something with more soul. Now, if Gates didn't think that 10 squillion was enough and he wanted to go for 20 squillion, he would have stayed in Microsoft or gone to a similar business that had high potential profitability. Instead, he invests in solving diseases in developing countries that the pharmaceutical companies don't find profitable. Oh, he's doing it to make more millions. Well, no, because if that was the route to making more millions, then AstraZeneca and GlaxoSmithKline and all the others would be in there. And that's kind of the point. Now, you don't have to believe that he's a saint. He made his wealth by exploiting a virtual monopoly after all. You don't have to believe that he's a nice man. You don't have to believe he's even good at what he does if you've got information to suggest the opposite. Whatever. I'm not saying you should like the guy. Absolutely, suit yourself. But you don't understand how the world works if you make no attempt to understand the dynamics of why people do what they do, where they do well, where it goes wrong, all of it. You can spend your life dismissing every worthy initiative, and I'm not specifically saying that Scopex is specifically worthy, just in general, on the basis that your cynicism won't allow you to believe anyone might act for the greater good. But you're going to miss out on the best of what's in people. You're going to live your life thinking that you live in a miserable world, and that's not going to make you happy. Let's put it another way. In your life, how many people do you meet who have good hearts and try to do the best they can? Quite a few, I expect. Most people know some people like that, often a lot of people like that. Why do you imagine that the worlds of business, of politics, of science, every place where people gather, doesn't have the same percentage of people like that as the ones that you know in your own life? I may sometimes be too optimistic, I accept. The senior business leaders I worked with came via business in the community, and to some degree you're self-selecting there for people who actually give a damn. But likewise, I know enough to know that pure cynicism about people, just like pure naive belief in them on the other side, misses the truth a lot more often than it nails it. For obvious reasons, there hasn't been much space for other news this week. But in other news, YouTube shut down the channel for the mainstream UK radio station Talk Radio. It didn't give any details about what had broken their guidelines, but pretty soon there was a very robust response, both by the channel and then by a number of other important other people. Talk Radio as a UK broadcaster is regulated by Ofcom, which means that they're obliged to have robust processes in place to ensure balance over time and to use public and verifiable information. I listen to talk radio sometimes, and presenters such as Julia Hartley-Brewer are certainly on the lockdown skeptic side of the pandemic debate, but she has numerous different guests on from all sides. She has government ministers, official government advisors, as well as credible skeptic voices, and the discussion is informed, curious, sometimes heated. In other words, exactly the sort of debate you expect to be having in a healthy democracy where extraordinary public policies are being followed. Even if you agree with lockdown, you should welcome the fact that some people will be challenging it robustly, because if they're right, it would be useful to learn that earlier rather than later. Anyway, after a day, YouTube reinstated them. They said this: "We quickly remove flagged content that violate our community guidelines, including COVID-19 content that explicitly contradict expert consensus from local health authorities or the World Health Organization. We make exceptions for material posted with an educational, documentary, scientific or artistic purpose, as was deemed in this case." This is simply chilling stuff. As far as we can see, their offence was that they had guests on who didn't toe a specific line, even though they're directly regulated and the regulator hadn't received complaints on that score. The BBC reported this: "YouTube has not published details of the offending posts, but independent fact-checkers have repeatedly challenged some of the claims made by interviewees featured by the London-based radio station." Well, yes. Are you saying that no interviewee ever said a wrong thing on the BBC? I mean, really? All of the rest of us are on notice. I mean, I'm rather assuming smaller YouTube channels won't get any priority reconsideration or reinstatement after just a day. It's just another ratcheting up of the line. First of all, it was out-and-out conspiracy theorists like David Icke who would say things like the virus doesn't exist and it's all 5G and nonsense. Now they've moved as far as talk radio. There's nowhere else to go after there. There are no rules we can learn, except learn by breaking them. It's not where we want to be. It's another reminder for me to be grateful for the good people who support this channel on Patreon. It enables me to keep producing content on the issues that matter, regardless whether they convey messages that YouTube will agree with or not. It enables me to put in the time it takes to produce 3 videos or more per week, even though a number of them require quite a bit of time and research. So, if you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused, non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please consider signing up at patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, hope you have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.